"Sir, you need to vacate this seat." The words sliced through the quiet hum of the boarding cabin, sharp and impersonal. They weren't a request. They were an order, delivered with the practiced efficiency of someone who deals with problems, not people. The man they were directed at, Sergeant Elias Thorne, looked up slowly from seat 12C. At 82 years old, his movements were deliberate, measured, a lifetime of discipline etched into the lines on his face, and the careful way he held himself. He was on his way from Dallas to West Point, a pilgrimage to see his grandson, Mark, graduate. A pilgrimage he'd been planning for a year. The seat he was in, an aisle seat with extra legroom, wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity he'd paid a premium for out of his modest pension. A necessity dictated by the shrapnel that still lived deep in his hip and the frayed nerves that screamed like phantom wires from a war half a century ago. "There must be a mistake," Elias said, his voice calm, but with a gravelly texture that spoke of age and authority. "This is my assigned seat. I have the confirmation right here." The flight attendant, her name tag reading Brenda, offered a tight, corporate smile. "There's no mistake, sir. We have a platinum status family that needs to be seated together, and we require this row. We have another seat for you. 34B. 34B. Elias didn't need to see the chart to know what that meant. A middle seat. In the back. A non-reclining sliver of space wedged between two strangers, where his leg would be compressed at an agonizing angle for 5 hours. It wasn't just discomfort. It was a sentence of escalating pain. He looked at Brenda, truly looked at her. Hoping to see a person behind the uniform, he saw only a checklist. "Ma'am," he began again, keeping his voice steady. "I am a disabled veteran. I booked this specific seat for medical reasons that are documented with your airline." Brenda's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened slightly. "I understand, sir, and we appreciate your service. However, airline policy requires me to prioritize seating for our premium status members. If you refuse to move, I will have to inform the captain that we have a passenger non-compliance issue, which will delay the departure of this aircraft for everyone." There it was, the threat, wrapped in the polite gauze of corporate procedure. He was no longer a person with a medical need. He was a non-compliance issue. A problem. He glanced around. The cabin was filling up. Phones were pointed in his direction. The low murmur of conversations shifted, and he could feel the weight of 100 impatient judgments settling on his shoulders. He was the old man holding up the flight, the selfish veteran causing a scene. He had become an inconvenience. The irony was a bitter pill. He had spent his life being the opposite of an inconvenience. In the 82nd Airborne, he was the man who went first, the man who carried the extra weight, the man who stood the longer watch. He had absorbed chaos so others could have order. Now, for asking only to sit in the seat he had paid for, he was the chaos. He took a slow breath, the air tasting of stale cleaner and recycled frustration. The ghosts of Fallujah flickered at the edge of his vision. The tight confines of a Humvee, the scream of an RPG, the moment his world became a universe of white-hot pain. He had learned then that some battles are not won by fighting, but by enduring. He looked at Brenda, then at the impatient, platinum family waiting behind her. He saw their faces, not with anger, but with a profound and weary sadness. They didn't see a man who had left pieces of himself in the Iraqi dust. They saw an obstacle. Slowly, stiffly, Elias Thorne began to move. He didn't unbuckle his seatbelt. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn, creased card. He handed it to Brenda. On it was his VA identification. "For your report," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Sergeant Elias Thorne, United States Army. I am vacating a medically necessary seat under duress to comply with airline policy." Brenda took the card, her expression unreadable. She didn't look at it. She simply nodded and motioned for the family to move forward. As Elias gathered his small carry-on, the father of the Platinum family brushed past him without a word, a scent of expensive cologne trailing in his wake. Elias limped down the aisle, a slow, painful journey into the heart of insignificance. Each step sent a jolt up his leg. He passed rows of faces, most averted, some curious, a few openly hostile. He didn't meet their eyes. He focused on the numbers on the overhead bins, a slow countdown to his new reality. 30, 31, 32, 33, 34. There it was. Seat B, a middle seat, a punishment cell in the sky. The armrests already claimed by a large man spilling over from the aisle, and a teenager with headphones on, oblivious in the window seat. He lowered himself into the space, his knee bending at an impossible angle. A sharp, searing pain shot through his hip. He closed his eyes, his jaw set like stone. He was invisible again, just another old man in the way. But he was wrong. He wasn't invisible. 3 rows ahead, in an aisle seat on the opposite side, Sarah Jenkins watched the entire exchange. A former war correspondent, she had spent years in places like Fallujah and Kandahar. She knew the look. She recognized the quiet, disciplined way Elias carried his pain, the resolute set of his jaw, the deep, abiding dignity of a man who had seen the worst of the world and refused to be broken by it. She had seen men like him carry the weight of a nation on their shoulders and never ask for a thing in return. And she had just watched a corporation, and by extension, a cabin full of people, tell him that his sacrifice was worth less than a credit card status. Her fingers flew across her phone, not to post on social media, but to send a direct, encrypted message to a number not many people had. A man she knew from her time in the field, now a senior vice president at this very airline. Her message was brief, factual, and colder than ice. Flight 227, DFW to SWF, Sergeant Elias Thorne, 82nd Airborne, disabled vet, forced from paid medical seat 12C to 34B to accommodate Platinum passengers. Crew lead Brenda dismissive. "This is a failure of your command. Fix it." She hit send. She didn't know if anything would happen, but she knew that silence, in the face of such a profound injustice, was a form of consent. And Sarah Jenkins did not consent. The story of Elias Thorne is more than just an incident on a plane. It's a reflection of the silent contract between a nation and its defenders. What do we owe the men and women who carry the scars, both seen and unseen? If you believe their honor should never be an inconvenience, subscribe to NX Incredible Stories and let us know in the comments what respect for our veterans looks like to you. We'll be right back after the cabin doors close. The cabin doors sealed with a heavy, final thud, locking Elias Thorne into his new world. Seat 34B wasn't just a place, it was a state of being. It was the physical manifestation of being forgotten. The air here at the back of the plane was different. Thicker, smelling of lavatory chemicals, and the faint aroma of microwaved food. The overhead light flickered once, then died, casting his small space in a perpetual twilight. He tried to adjust his leg, but there was nowhere to go. The knee of the man to his right was a fleshy wall. The seat back in front of him was an unyielding barrier. The pain in his hip, once a dull, manageable ache, was now a sharp, insistent throb, a metronome counting out the seconds of his 5-hour ordeal. With each pulse of the engines, it sent a fresh wave of fire down his leg. He pressed his eyes shut, trying to retreat into the disciplined corners of his mind, the place where he had always stored his pain. But the cramped space was a trigger. The feeling of being pinned, unable to move, was too familiar. The low drone of the aircraft began to morph, twisting into the high-pitched whine of a Black Hawk helicopter. The stale cabin air thickened, smelling of diesel fumes and hot metal. The pressure in his ears became the concussive thump of distant mortars. He was no longer in a passenger jet over America. He was back in the narrow, stifling confines of an M113 armored personnel carrier, rattling through the dusty streets of Fallujah. He could feel the weight of his gear, the grit of sand in his teeth, the suffocating heat. He could hear the young voices of the men around him. Boys, really, their laughter too loud, a fragile shield against the fear that was a constant, living thing in the air. He gripped the plastic armrest, his knuckles white. His breathing hitched. "Stay in the now, Sergeant," he ordered himself, the old command echoing in his head. "You are on a plane. You are going to see Mark. You are safe." But the ghosts were loud today. The pain was a key, and it had unlocked a door he tried to keep bolted shut. He was 82 years old, but in that moment, he was also 32, a staff sergeant with the lives of his men in his hands, driving into an ambush he couldn't see coming. Meanwhile, 3 rows ahead, Sarah Jenkins stared at her phone. A reply had come through almost instantly. "Stand by, Sarah." Escalating to flight command. She felt a small knot of tension ease in her chest. Her contact, David Chen, was a man of his word. He had been a Marine captain before he'd put on a corporate suit, and Sarah knew that for some men, the uniform never really comes off. It just changes shape. She allowed herself a glance back at Sergeant Thorne. He was motionless, his head leaning against the vibrating fuselage, his eyes closed. To anyone else, he looked like an old man sleeping. But Sarah saw the rigid line of his jaw, the tight cords of muscle in his neck, the shallow, controlled breaths. He wasn't sleeping. He was enduring. He was doing what soldiers are taught to do: compartmentalize the pain, lock it in a box, and function. This sight reminded her of another story, another invisible hero she had covered years ago. It was a piece about urban decay in Baltimore. She had been interviewing a city sanitation worker, a man named Marcus, who had worked the same route for 40 years. He was quiet, almost shy, and his co-workers described him as the most reliable man they'd ever known. One day, during the interview, his sleeve rode up, and Sarah saw a tattoo, a faded, blurry image of a tiger with a lightning bolt. She recognized the insignia of a special operations unit from the Korean War. Gently, she had asked him about it. Marcus had been hesitant, but then he'd quietly told her. He had been a ranger. He had been part of a brutal, desperate battle at Chipyong-ni, where his small unit had held off a force 10 times its size for 3 days in the frozen hell of a Korean winter. He had earned a Silver Star for pulling his wounded lieutenant to safety under a hail of machine gun fire. He never spoke of it. His own family barely knew the details. For 40 years, he had quietly woken up at 4 a.m., put on one uniform, and gone to clean the city's streets, his heroism as invisible to the world as the medal tucked away in a dusty box in his closet. "Duty's duty," he had told her with a shrug. "Doesn't matter what you're wearing." That story had always stuck with her. The world was full of men like Marcus and Sergeant Thorne, men who had walked through fire and returned to a world that had no frame of reference for their sacrifice, a world that saw them not as heroes, but as sanitation workers, as inconvenient old men on an airplane. They didn't ask for parades. They didn't ask for praise. They just asked for a little space, a little quiet, a little dignity. and too often Sarah thought even that was too much to ask. Back in seat 34B, Elias was losing his own battle. The teenager by the window had fallen asleep, his head lolling onto Elias's shoulder. The large man on the aisle was now snoring softly, his arm firmly planted across the shared armrest. Elias was pinned, a prisoner of their oblivious comfort. The pain in his leg was no longer a throb. It was a constant, blinding sheet of white fire. He could feel sweat beading on his forehead. His heart was hammering against his ribs. Just breathe, Sergeant. In, out, control the breathing, control the world. But the cabin walls were closing in, the air was getting thin, and the ghosts of Fallujah were whispering his name. He was not on a plane to see his grandson. He was trapped. He was back in the burning metal box, and the exits were sealed. He was beginning to drown, not in water, but in the crushing weight of memory and pain. And no one could see. No one knew. He was utterly and completely alone. In the serene, focused world of the cockpit, Captain Jacob Vance was completing his pre-flight checklist. At 45, he was a man forged by precision and responsibility. A graduate of the Air Force Academy, he had flown C-17s into the hot, contested airspace of Iraq and Afghanistan. He knew the weight of command, the feel of a multi-ton aircraft responding to his slightest touch, and the unwritten laws of loyalty that bound servicemen together. His co-pilot was reading out the final checks when a small, amber light flashed on his primary display. It was an ACARS message, but flagged with a red priority marker from Airline Operations Control. Unusual for this stage of flight prep. He tapped the screen. The message was concise, almost military in its brevity. To Captain J. Vance, Felt 227, from D. Chen, VP Ops, RE, Passenger Incident, Urgent, flagged by S. Jenkins, Credimar Reporter. Passenger Elias Thorne, Sergeant U.S. Army, Ret. 82nd Airborne, disabled, moved from paid med seat 12C to 34B for Plat status packs. Crew non-responsive. Your discretion advised. Uphold the standard. Vance read it twice. The words seemed to lift off the screen. 82nd Airborne. Disabled. Uphold the standard. The last phrase wasn't corporate jargon. It was a call. David Chen was a former Marine. He and Vance had shared a drink once at a conference. Two ex-military men navigating a civilian world. They understood each other. Uphold the standard meant something. It meant the code of honor trumped the policy manual. Every time. Hold the taxi, Vance said, his voice calm, but with an edge of steel that made his co-pilot look up, surprised. Captain, we're cleared for the runway. Hold, the taxi, Vance repeated, already unbuckling his harness. I've got a standard to uphold. He pushed back from the controls, stood tall in the confined space, and adjusted his uniform jacket. He ran a hand over the crisp gold stripes on his epaulettes. This wasn't about an unhappy customer anymore. This was about a failure in his command, his plane, his crew, his watch. Any injustice that happened on his aircraft was, by definition, his responsibility. He stepped out of the cockpit into the forward galley. Brenda, the flight attendant, was arranging coffee cups, her back to him. "Brenda," he said. She turned, startled. "Captain, is everything all right?" "No," he said, his voice low and even. "It's not. Where's the passenger who was in seat 12C?" Brenda's professional composure flickered. She swallowed. He was relocated to accommodate a priority family, Captain. Per the manual. He's in 34B. "Show me," Vance commanded. He didn't wait for an answer. He began walking down the aisle. The energy in the cabin shifted instantly. The hum of conversation died. Heads turned, phones were lowered. The presence of the captain, out of the cockpit before takeoff, was an event. His face was a mask of calm, professional resolve, but his eyes were scanning the rows with an intensity that made people sit up a little straighter. He moved with a purpose that brooked no argument. A man walking his own quarterdeck. Sarah Jenkins saw him coming, and her heart gave a lurch. She watched as he passed her row, his eyes locking onto the numbers in the back. 32, 33, 34. He stopped. He stood there for a moment, looking down into the cramped, dim space of row 34. He saw the sleeping teenager, the snoring businessman, and wedged between them, he saw the old soldier. He saw the pale, sweat-sheened face, the clenched jaw, the tremor in the hand gripping the armrest. He saw a man not just in discomfort, but in a private, desperate battle. Jacob Vance, who had flown medevac missions and seen the faces of wounded warriors airlifted from the battlefield, recognized that look. It was the look of a man holding on by a thread. Elias Thorne, lost in the echoing chaos of his memories, felt a shadow fall over him. He blinked, his vision swimming back into focus from the dusty streets of Fallujah to the dim cabin of a Boeing jet. He looked up and saw the uniform. 4 gold stripes on the shoulder, silver wings on the chest, and a face that was not looking at him with pity or impatience, but with a sudden, startling clarity of recognition. And then, in the dead silence of the cabin, in front of 100 passengers, Captain Jacob Vance drew himself up to his full height, brought his right hand up in a motion as sharp and precise as a blade, and rendered a formal, perfect salute. The air in the cabin seemed to crystallize. It was a single, silent gesture, but it landed with the force of a thunderclap. It was a gesture that said, "I see you." It said, "I know who you are." It said, "You are not invisible, not on my watch." Elias stared, his mind struggling to bridge the gap between the hell he was in and the honor he was being shown. He tried to speak, but no words came. His eyes, which had remained dry through it all, suddenly burned. The captain held the salute for a long, respectful moment before lowering his hand. "Sergeant Elias Thorne," he said, his voice clear and unwavering, carrying through the silent cabin. "Captain Jacob Vance, on behalf of this airline, and as a fellow serviceman, I want to offer you my deepest and most sincere apology. You should never have been asked to move. This was a failure on our part, and I am here to correct it. It's in moments like these that true leadership is defined, not by the policies we enforce, but by the principles we defend. Captain Vance had a choice, and he chose honor over procedure. Have you ever seen an act of leadership that truly inspired you? Share it in the comments below. We believe these are the stories that need to be told. The captain's salute hung in the air, a silent, powerful testament that had fundamentally altered the reality of the cabin. Elias Thorne was no longer an inconvenience in seat 34B. He was a sergeant, publicly acknowledged and honored. The passengers, who had been islands of isolated self-interest, were now a single, unified audience, witnesses to a moment of profound moral clarity. Captain Vance turned his attention to Brenda, who had followed him down the aisle and now stood frozen, her face pale. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice still calm, but now imbued with the full weight of his command. "You will personally escort Sergeant Thorne to seat 1A. Brenda stammered, "Captain, but first class is fully booked. Seat 1A is occupied." "Then you will ask the passenger in 1A to volunteer their seat," Vance replied without missing a beat. "You will explain that the captain of this aircraft is personally requesting it on behalf of a decorated and disabled combat veteran of the United States Army. And if they decline, you will come back and inform me. and I will give the sergeant my own jump seat in the cockpit. Am I understood?" "Yes, Captain," she whispered, her corporate confidence shattered, replaced by a raw understanding of the new hierarchy of values on this plane. Honor, it turned out, outranked platinum. Elias began to push himself up, a reflexive protest on his lips. "Sir, this isn't necessary." "With all due respect, Sergeant, it is," Captain Vance interrupted gently, placing a steadying hand on Elias's shoulder. "Please, allow us to correct our failure. We owe you that much, and more." As Elias slowly, painfully, rose from the cramped seat, the two men beside him scrambled to make way. The businessman who had claimed the armrest now looked ashamed, his eyes fixed on the floor. The teenager had ripped off his headphones, his face a mixture of awe and embarrassment. He muttered, "Sorry, sir. I'm so sorry." As Elias, steadied by the captain's hand, stepped into the aisle, another voice cut through the silence. It wasn't loud, but it was filled with an authority of its own. "Airborne, Sergeant." Elias turned his head. A few rows back, a young man in his late 20s was getting to his feet. He was dressed in civilian clothes, jeans and a hoodie, but his posture was ramrod straight, his haircut military short. His eyes were locked on Elias. Elias's own eyes, clouded with pain and age, sharpened with recognition. He saw the patch on the young man's backpack, the screaming eagle of the 101st. "At ease, soldier," Elias said, the old title falling from his lips as naturally as breathing. "Can't, Sergeant," the young man replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Not in your presence." He was standing at attention in the narrow aisle of an airplane. "Specialist Miller. I was with the 101st in Afghanistan. My father, he was 82nd Airborne, Vietnam. He always told me, 'You see an old paratrooper, you show your respect,' because he taught us the way." He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant." A ripple of emotion went through the cabin. This wasn't just about one old man anymore. It was about a legacy, a chain of honor passed down from one generation to the next, a brotherhood that time and distance could not break. As Brenda led Elias toward the front of the plane, a strange and beautiful thing began to happen. People started to meet his eye. An older woman reached out and briefly touched his arm as he passed. A businessman in a suit gave him a solemn nod. The invisible man was now the most seen person on the flight. When they reached first class, the passenger in 1A, a man in a crisp polo shirt, was already on his feet, his carry-on in hand. He had heard everything. He didn't wait to be asked. He simply stepped aside and looked at Elias. "Sir," he said quietly, "it would be my honor." Elias, overwhelmed, could only dip his head in thanks. He settled into the spacious seat, the soft leather a world away from the hard plastic of 34B. He stretched out his wounded leg, and for the first time in hours, a wave of relief washed over the searing pain. But the captain wasn't finished. He stepped to the forward intercom, not to announce their departure, but to solidify the lesson. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice echoed through the cabin, steady and deliberate. "This is your captain speaking. In a few moments, we will be underway. But before we do, I want to take a moment to address what you have just witnessed. Today, on this aircraft, we made a mistake. We traded honor for convenience. We valued a policy over a person. We looked at a man who has sacrificed for this country, who wears the cost of that sacrifice every single day, and we told him he was in the way." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Let me be unequivocally clear. That is not who we are. Not on my command. The uniform he wore is the reason we have the freedom to fly in peace. The injuries he carries are the price of that freedom. We will not, on this flight or any other I command, treat that sacrifice as an inconvenience. We will treat it with the highest honor and respect. We don't leave our wounded behind. Not on the battlefield, and not at 30,000 feet. We are running approximately 9 minutes behind schedule. I will personally file a report taking full responsibility, and I will consider it the best 9 minutes I have ever spent in my career. Cabin crew, prepare for departure. He clicked off the microphone, and then the applause started. It wasn't the polite, scattered applause of a crowd. It was a groundswell. It started with the young soldier from the 101st, who was on his feet, clapping loud and hard. It spread to Sarah Jenkins, tears streaming down her face. It rolled through the entire plane, row by row, a heartfelt, thunderous ovation. It wasn't just for Elias. It was for Captain Vance. It was for the young soldier. It was for the idea that, even in a rushed and cynical world, honor still had a place. It was a vote, a unanimous declaration that what had just happened was right. Elias Thorne sat in seat 1A, his head bowed not in shame, but under the unfamiliar weight of gratitude. He just listened to the sound, feeling a warmth spread through his chest, healing a wound far deeper than any piece of shrapnel could ever make. The plane touched down at Stewart International Airport, the gateway to West Point, with the gentle precision of a bird of prey landing on its perch. The sunlight that streamed through the first-class windows seemed warmer, kinder. As the seatbelt sign switched off and the usual bustle of deplaning began, a quiet reverence remained. Passengers who passed Elias offered a nod, a soft "thank you," or a simple, respectful smile. The honor that Captain Vance had ignited in the cabin had not dissipated upon landing. It had solidified. At the jet bridge, Captain Vance was waiting. He didn't say much. He just shook Elias's hand, a firm, meaningful grip. "It was an honor to have you on my flight, Sergeant," he said. "The honor was all mine, Captain," Elias replied, his voice raspy with emotion. "You lead good men." In the terminal, a young man in a crisp gray cadet uniform stood anxiously scanning the crowd. He held a simple hand-drawn sign, "Go Army, beat Navy, and welcome, Grandpa." When he saw Elias limping toward him, his face broke into a wide grin, and he rushed forward, enveloping the old man in a hug that was full of youthful strength and profound love. "Grandpa, you made it," Mark said, pulling back to look at him. "Your leg, was the flight okay?" Elias looked at his grandson, the future of the long gray line, the reason for this entire journey. He smiled, a true, deep smile that reached his eyes. "The flight was educational, Mark, very educational." That afternoon, they walked the hallowed grounds of West Point. They stood at Trophy Point, overlooking the Hudson River, the same view that generations of cadets had seen before them. They didn't talk about the flight right away. Elias asked about Mark's studies, his training, his readiness to become an officer in the United States Army. Then, Mark turned to him, his expression serious. "I heard what happened, Grandpa. A woman on the plane, a journalist, she posted about it. It's everywhere." Elias nodded slowly. "Sometimes things happen." "She said you never raised your voice," Mark said, his own voice filled with a kind of awe. "She said you just stood on your dignity. I've learned about two kinds of courage here, Grandpa. There's the battlefield kind, the one that makes you run toward the sound of the guns. But then there's another kind, the kind it takes to endure being invisible. The kind it takes to hold on to your honor when no one else seems to value it. I think that second kind might be the hardest of all." Elias placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "The first kind of courage gets you the medals, son. The second kind, that gets you through the rest of your life. You're going to need both." The story didn't end there. The ripples from Captain Vance's small act of rebellion spread wider than anyone could have imagined. Sarah Jenkins's article wasn't just a viral post, it became a feature story in a national magazine. A thoughtful, powerful piece about the quiet contract between a nation and its warriors. It sparked a conversation. The airline, facing a public relations storm but also an opportunity, responded decisively. The vice president, David Chen, a man who understood both corporate balance sheets and military codes, didn't just issue a standard apology. He flew to West Point to meet Elias Thorne in person. 2 weeks later, the airline announced the Elias Thorne Initiative. It was a new system-wide policy ensuring that all disabled veterans with documented medical needs would receive priority seating and pre-boarding, no questions asked. It was a small change in a massive system, but it was a change born of honor. A policy was rewritten because a man of principle refused to let a bad one stand. Elias received letters, hundreds of them, from other veterans who had felt invisible, from Gold Star mothers, from active duty soldiers, from ordinary citizens who simply wanted to say thank you. One letter, on thick, formal stationery, came from the young soldier on the plane, the specialist from the 101st. He wrote that after seeing what happened, he had made a decision. He was re-enlisting to become a warrant officer, to become a pilot, because, he wrote, "Captain Vance showed me that a leader's true power is to lift people up, and I want to spend my life doing that." Months later, under the vast open sky of New York, Elias sat in the stands at Maichi Stadium. A sea of gray and white uniforms moved with perfect precision on the field below. It was graduation day at West Point, when the announcer called the name Cadet Mark Thorne. Elias leaned forward, his old heart swelling with a pride so fierce it ached. He watched Mark stride across the stage, shake the hands of generals, and accept his diploma. Now a second lieutenant in the United States Army. But the true ceremony happened a moment later. As the newly commissioned officers threw their caps into the air in a joyous explosion, Mark broke from the crowd. He scanned the stands, his eyes searching. Then he found him. Across the field, across the cheering crowd, his gaze locked with his grandfather's. And there, on the field of America's future leaders, Lieutenant Mark Thorne ignored the chaos around him, stood ramrod straight, and rendered a slow, perfect salute directly to the old paratrooper in the stands. Elias Thorne, surrounded by strangers, slowly rose to his feet. With a hand that no longer trembled, he returned the salute. It was a silent conversation across time, a seamless transfer of duty, honor, and country. In that shared gesture, a promise was kept, a legacy was secured, and the watch was passed. The story of Elias Thorne became a testament to a simple, powerful truth. Heroism is not confined to the past or to the battlefield. It is a choice available to us all every single day. It is the choice to see the person, not the problem, to choose honor over convenience, and to stand up and offer a salute, metaphorical or real, to the quiet, dignified heroes who walk among us. They are our fathers, our grandfathers, our neighbors. They carry the weight of our freedom in the quiet pain in their joints and in the silent memories behind their eyes. They do not ask for much, but they have earned our respect. Our final lesson is this: never underestimate the power of a single, principled act. It can stop a plane. It can change a policy. It can restore a man's soul. And as we saw today, It can pass the torch of honor from one generation to the next, ensuring the echoes of duty are never lost to silence. Thank you for joining us on NX Incredible Stories. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing and sharing it. Let's work together to keep these stories of honor alive. Until next time, remember the heroes among you.